Okay, Boxing Fanatics, welcome to the ninth episode of the Boxing Fanatics podcast. I'm joined again today by Mr. Oscar Pick. Today we're gonna have a bit of a bit of a different podcast because we're gonna talk about, well, I guess a bit of a hot topic in boxing at the moment, which is the revelation that Dana White and Turkey are gonna join forces along with I believe Nick Khan from WWE. And yeah, they want to introduce some sort of boxing league, and I guess it sounds like they want to kind of revolutionize um, boxing. So anyway, Oscar, what was your initial thoughts when this news came out that Turkey was teaming up with Dana?
Yeah, I was quite surprised of the timing, to be fair, because I always like Dana White. I kind of take a passing interest in the UFC and the world of MMA, and I've noticed Dana White. He talks about boxing a lot. I believe he started off in boxing. I'm not sure if he ever worked in boxing, but I believe that was his first passion in combat sports, and
Hmm.
he's always kind of teased an involvement. So it was one of them things that you could have always kind of expect. But then, for it to sort of become a reality was quite surprising, especially uh, with him doing it alongside Turki Al-Sheikh. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions, but when they first introduced this idea of a boxing league, and you're obviously right, it's kind of going to be called like the TKO League or something along those lines. But since then, I saw like an interview that Dana White did with Dan Raphael, and he says it's not actually going to be a league; it's going to be basically a promotion,
Hmm.
and they're just gonna. It's just a case of them having one belt per division. I think they're going to reduce the amount of weight divisions as well. So yeah, I mean, it was an interesting one. Like, it's one of them where you see, a powerful, influential guy like Dana White coming in, and obviously with all the money that's behind Turk Al-Sheikh as well, you can already sense that it's going to be, a really powerful relationship. They're not just coming in to make up the numbers. Whether it's going to go the way they think it is, totally like and that's a totally different question altogether. Because we all know boxing, it's it's not
Hmm.
exactly the most simple sport in the world. There's a lot of people involved. There's a lot of promoters. There's a lot of sanctioning
Hmm.
bodies, and they've come. Well, they're claiming that they're going to sort of clean up the sport, but there's a lot of mess to clean up as far as I'm concerned. So it'll be interesting to see how they approach that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They say boxing is like the Wild West. Well, I mean, it's like you said. I mean, there's so many moving parts in boxing. You know, all the sanction bodies, the sheer number of boxers. I think with Dana and UFC, it was a lot easier for him to kind of monopolize the sport because there's just less competition. Let's be honest, like Bellator and these other promotional outfits, they weren't really that powerful. So Dana's still done an amazing job with UFC, but it was a lot easier. But then you've got some massive players in boxing. You know, the likes of Eddie Hearn, Oscar De La Hoya, Frank Warren. These are, top promoters who've been around for a long, long time. And it's interesting. I think Dana's done this partly because I think he sees that boxing is on the rise recently, and I think he is maybe starting to compete a bit more with the UFC in America because I think in America UFC was arguably a bit popular, a bit more popular than boxing, but because of Turkey and stuff, boxing's on the rise again. But what I find interesting about what Dana said is that like boxing is broken. That's the kind of terminology he used. And when you think about something, it does sound kind of broken when you've got like regular titles and they're kind of considered world titles, and you've got all these crazy amounts of weight divisions, and mandatory challenges not being called and that kind of thing. Do you think that's fair to call boxing? Like, is boxing broken in your opinion?
I think it is, but I think it's broken for slightly different reasons. Like, I mean, first of all, the sanctioning bodies, like, it's important that obviously we highlight that because I think for me, having four belts per weight division, like when I first started taking an interest in boxing, for me, the idea of, two champions fighting and there being like a unification, I always quite liked that idea of having, you know, um, belts being unified and then eventually, one undisputed champion. I know it doesn't always, well, it rarely pans out like that,
Mhm.
but I remember at the time thinking that was quite a cool idea, quite a cool concept. And, it's important to say that in other sports like tennis, for example, I'm not a massive fan, but I know that you've got obviously Wimbledon,
Mhm,
US Open, a lot of different, major tournaments. There's
mhm,
not necessarily like one world champion in those sports either.
mhm,
For me, where the sport's broken is like, I don't mind having four belts per weight division, but it's the fact that these sanctioning bodies, the way they operate, they take first of all they're taking 3% off of each fighter's purse if there's
mhm,
like a WBC or an IBF title on the line.
mhm, mhm,
They're taking a large chunk of that, and then you kind of think to yourself, well, where's that money actually going? And I know Maurizio Suleiman, he likes to think of himself as some sort of innovator, like he kind of waxes lyrical about all this great stuff that the WBC do. You mentioned their clean boxing program, which I believe is in a bit of a mess, to be honest. And then you've got, all these other initiatives that he's tried to introduce in the past. And fair play to him for trying to do that because he's, at least he's taking quite an active approach to it. But then you look at, you know, all the sanctioning bodies and you kind of think to yourself, well, they're all operating differently. They all have their own rankings. Then you look at the rankings and you think to yourself, well, how's that fighter got himself or herself
mhm,
up to that top position? Because if the rankings were done properly and it was based solely on merit, then it'd be so much easier to do. But because certain promoters, certain managers have got good relationships with these sanctioning bodies, you're seeing really obscure fighters who no one's ever heard of just emerge into the top 10, top five even of these sanctioning body rankings. And I
mhm,
think for me, that's where the sport is broken. Like, I don't, as I said at the beginning, like the idea of having unifications and undisputed fights, I don't mind that personally. I can see why that's confusing from a casual fan perspective.
mhm,
But
mhm,
I think the broken aspect for me is definitely those rankings where you're seeing, fighters are in those rankings when they shouldn't be. And then they get opportunities over other fighters who are way more deserving of, world title shots. Um, and then, even beyond the sanctioning bodies, you can go into so much detail about how boxing is broken, just in terms of, the fact that everyone always says it, but the fact that there's no overarching governing body, the
mhm,
fact that you've got a fighter like Ryan Garcia, to just use him as an example, where he fails a drugs test with the New York State Athletic Commission. And then I know it never happened, but he obviously had a scheduled exhibition bout with a completely different commission. The fact that you can do that as a fighter, you can approach another commission or another governing body and apply for a license there where you might be banned in a different commission is that's what makes it confusing. That's what makes it a complete mess. So you've got really, as you say, you've got the Wild West. This is the industry that these promoters, these managers, these sanctioning bodies are all operating in.
mhm.
And even just trying to explain it there, like I'm sort of feel like I'm losing my mind because it's just a complete and utter mess. Basically, it's a shit show.
Yeah, 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 yeah. There is a lack of overriding, I guess, governance. There's like, yeah, there's a lack of oversee, like, yeah, just this, the lack of, I guess, significant governance. And it's well, like you said there, you know, if someone fails a drugs test, I mean, we saw with the Conor Ben situation, that's a brilliant example of how much of a mess it is sometimes. It was dealt with in such a weird way. Remember the WBC exonerated him for eggs, but then UCAD weren't convinced, and then you got VADA, and then and it's just crazy. And then you've got you know, some sanctioning bodies imposing the mandatories, others haven't. WBC is quite notorious for, keeping people out in the dark a little bit. Then you've got the IBF, which is a bit more strict and actually pushes it. It's a crazy sport. It really is. It's mental when you think about it. And like you said, yeah, I'm not surprised casuals don't have a clue what's going on because even as hardcore fans, we're just like, what is going on sometimes? But I think if we're comparing with UFC, where boxing is actually better is that it's actually better for the fighters in terms of finances because it's no big secret that the top guys in boxing get paid a lot more than the guys in UFC. It's not even close. You got people like Canelo, like Anthony Joshua making tens of millions per fight, which doesn't seem to be the case in UFC. I'm just gonna read out. You've probably seen this, Oscar. I just want to read out the the kind of what was leaked in terms of the TKO model. So it was 20,000 for a 10-round bout by an unranked fighter. You get 50,000 when ranked by the company at number 5 to number 10, 125,000 when ranked by the company at number 3 or number 4, 375,000 when challenging for the company championship, and 755,000, sorry, dollars when defending the company championship. What do you make? What do you? Obviously, we don't know the whole ins and outs, but what do you make of those figures compared to what we hear about in boxing? In boxing.
Yeah, obviously they're not substantial figures, but I think with TKO, I think at the initial stage anyway, they're going to look to sign as many prospects as possible. So, these prospects aren't going to necessarily expect to be paid enormous sums of money to begin with. And let's not forget Dana White. He has already got some involvement in boxing. He works quite closely with Tom Loeffler, who's obviously an experienced promoter in his own right, and they stage shows on UFC Fight Pass. So you've got Callum Walsh who fought, I think it was last weekend,
Mhm.
and a few other fighters who are sort of signed to that. Well, Tom Loeffler's promotion at least, but he's working closely with Dana White. So I think, as I say, like from what I've heard from Dana White, it sounds like it's going to be a case of because he said that he's already started speaking to about 150 fighters. I think he said.
Mhm.
I'm guessing that's obviously mostly prospects. I don't think there's going to be too many established names in that mix to begin with. But yeah, I think a lot of those fighters might already be signed to Tom Loeffler or Dana White. Like they must have not a massive stable, but they've clearly got fighters already signed to them. And I think yeah, with the numbers that we've seen, I think it was reported by Boxing Scene, the fight purses. I think obviously it might sound quite shocking to begin with, but when you consider the fact that it's going to be a lot of prospects who aren't going to necessarily expect to be paid too much, then it kind of makes sense. Um, so I think that's what they're doing. I think Dana White's probably looking at it from a perspective where if he signs, all of the most talented prospects in boxing, or at least a large chunk of them, then he can, sign them to long term contracts, and
Mhm.
then that's where the promotion can then start to take shape. Because he's not going to be able to, immediately get these massive names like Anthony Joshua, for example, who's obviously signed with Matchroom,
Mhm.
and then just even Canelo. I know Canelo signed with Turkey, but he might have certain preferences and stuff that Dana White might not be able to kind of deal with. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, that's what I kind of view it as at the minute. I think it's going to be sort of a prospect promotion. Whether he can actually sign as many prospects as he thinks is another thing. Because just looking at the Olympics, for example, like whenever you see a gold medalist or even a silver medalist, you've got all these promoters fighting over, um, to sign that prospect.
Mhm.
So it's not going to be easy, especially if he's not offering astronomical sums of money straight away. Obviously fighters might be tempted by the sort of long-term plan that he might have in place, but there'll still be the likes of Eddie Hearn, PBC, all of these guys sniffing around. So whether he can actually do that or not, I'm not sure.
I mean, that is a good point about the prospects. I mean, it sounds good in that way because that means we're going to get a lot of competitive fights, and I do actually like the idea of a promotional outfit where you've got all these young fighters battling out, and you just it's like the UFC. You almost guaranteed to have good fights every week because, well, I guess journeyman won't. I assume won't exist. Yeah, journeyman won't exist in that setup because. Yeah, it'll all be prospects. But like you mentioned there as well, I'm struggling to see the incentive for a top amateur. Top amateur, if you're a gold medalist, and you've got, I don't know, I don't know how much they're getting paid, but we hear, even the likes of like Fraser Clark when he was signed with Boxer, he was getting paid a lot. Obviously, Ben Whitaker's been paid a lot by Boxer. So that's what I'm trying to see where the incentive is going to come from. But like you said, I guess at the beginning he's going to have to build the company up. I'm just not sure if he can. I guess though nothing's going to happen overnight. I just think he's got his work cut out for him if he thinks he's going to monopolize boxing because there's a lot of competition. Basically, there's a lot of competition, but it might not be a bad addition if, like I said, we're seeing good fights every week. Um, what did you make of? So this was kind of interesting. Turkey kind of well, kind of implying that he was kind of gonna go against the other promoters and then kind of backtracking a little bit. What did you make of kind of yeah? What did you make of that? Like Turkey kind of yeah going against them, but then also backtracking after.
Yeah, I mean, what do you mean in terms of him backtracking? Because I'm not sure.
So at the start, he kind of implied that he would be like direct competition with the likes of Eddie Hearn, Frank Warren, and it's almost like I don't know. He didn't really explicitly say he wouldn't work with them, but it was almost like okay, he's not going to. Yeah, there is competitors basically. There is competitors. So,
Yeah.
but then after he kind of said that, look, this new promotion is not it's not against anyone. It's just something separate. If that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I found that interesting, and what I found particularly interesting is obviously you've got Frank and Eddie who are working closely with Turkey, and I remember watching an interview like a few weeks back where Frank was having a bit of a moan of how much work he's having to do around the promotion for Canelo versus William Skull. And I was
Hmm.
thinking to myself, well, he hasn't got any Queensbury fighters on that bill, but he's still having to work on the promotion and on the production for that show. So, in a sense, Turkey has got all these promoters like Frank and Eddie
Hmm.
just absolutely singing from his hymn sheet he's sort of got them on strings in that sense. I think where not only are they having to work on their own shows, they're having to work on different shows. Like Frank, he shouldn't even be involved in Canelo versus Skull, but he is because Turkey kind of expects him to. I think he just expects him to put in that extra work. So that's quite interesting. And yeah, I mean, with Turkey, sort of saying he's going to crush like the competition and stuff. I think he's made it clear that he wants to put all of his faith into Dana White, which I can see why, because Dana, what he's done with the UFC, I know it's a completely different sport, and when he did introduce the UFC, or when he bought the UFC,
Hmm.
MMA was still very much in its infancy, so he's not necessarily going to be able to replicate that success in boxing. But I can see why he's, taken a shine to Dana White in terms of his like entrepreneurial skills and whatnot. Um, what that means for the other promoters, I'm not quite sure. I don't think they're going to be kicked out of the sport straight away, but it might be a slow process in terms of Dana and Turkey kind of slowly, building that promotion up to the point where it becomes this juggernaut basically, and no one can actually compete with it. But I think with Turkey and Dana, that they've also sort of they've said that they want to get rid of the sanctioning bodies effectively. So we saw at the Canelo versus Skull press
Hmm.
conference where Canelo wanted to hold up his WBC belt, and Turkey was like, no, he told Eddie Reynoso to keep that to himself. I thought that was quite a clear sign that Turkey is not going to be beholden to these sanctioning bodies. And we also are seeing that a little bit with the Dimitri Bivol, David Benavidez situation, I think, where, before the rematch between Bivol and Beterbiev, Turkey was, quite keen on that fight between, like, whoever won. He was like, David Benavidez should fight the winner. He even invited David Benavidez to Riyadh so that he could, be there to kind of build that promotion from early. But yeah, I mean, with that situation now, it just seems like it's a clear statement that he just doesn't want to be working with the WBC because they've obviously ordered that fight. They've ordered Bivol Benavidez, and they've said that purse bids will be called in April. So I think this is all already a sign that Turkey and Dana they're not going to be, doing what the sanctioning bodies tell them to.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And Turkey did actually also make a point. He said something along the lines of to Dimitri Bivol, like, remember who's kind of I forgot what the wording was.
Who's paying you basically? Like,
Who's
yeah.
paying you? Yeah. So that was interesting. That was yeah, that was quite the comment to be fair. I mean, yeah, the sanctioning bodies. I don't know. It's not about the sanctioning bodies at the end of the day. It's about the fighters. Um, but that's interesting because I think people the thing with PBC as well is kind of it's almost like a bit of an outcast promotion a little bit. They're kind of very reluctant to work with anyone, and but that fight, and I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. I don't know if you have any insight about Dimitri Bivol versus Benavidez. But that might be another example of there just being some sort of conflict there in terms of the actual promotion of have you got any insight on that in
No,
Benavidez?
I saw an interview with Samson Lukowitz, who's David Benavidez's promoter, and he seemed quite frustrated in terms of, Team Benavidez clearly want that fight. And he was kind of accusing Turki Al-Sheikh of being a rookie in boxing and saying that he doesn't know the business. Because obviously they want to stage that fight in America, and it doesn't look like Turkey's willing to play ball with them at this point. At least that's what it seems like to me. He wants to make that Bivol Beterbiev rematch, trilogy fight. Sorry.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think from what I can tell, that there's basically no negotiations happening at that point, at this point at least, for Bivol Benavides.
Which is disappointing because I think when Turkey came into the sport, he was meant to kind of remove this kind of this conflict, but now it's almost in this situation we're seeing this kind of conflict between promoters kind of come back up again, which is which would be disappointing. I prefer, for me personally, I'd prefer to see Bivol versus Beterbiev. Sorry, Bivol versus Benavidez. I think it'd be nice to have a little break between Bivol Beterbiev, even though they are fantastic fights and you're almost guaranteed a great fight. I would like to see Benavidez, but that'll be very interesting. I think if that fight doesn't happen, then it's not really a good sign really for boxing, because it shows that there's still conflict there. But anyway, we're gonna leave it with that. Thanks again to Oscar for joining me, and guys in the comments, let us know what you think about this development in the boxing world. Is it good for the sport? Is it bad for the sport? Let's see. Time will tell. And as always, guys, comment, like, subscribe, and yeah, we'll catch you on the next one. Cheers.